All right, welcome back, guys. We are now into the second half of the 1920s in terms of our coverage here in the APUSH curriculum. Topic 7.8, Cultural and Political Controversies of the 1920s. Let's get into the effects of the movement and settlement patterns first. And let's look at the resurgence, sadly, of the Ku Klux Klan. So the last time we looked at the KKK was during the Reconstruction. That's when it was formed. It was designed basically to keep Black Americans in the South politically isolated and weak, and not allow them to take advantage of all the freedoms of the emancipation of slavery. And then what we're going to see is in the 1920s, the KKK comes roaring back. So that the original Klan had basically had been largely defeated through the Force Acts, and it kind of just faded out. I mean, it was still in the shadows, but in the 1920s, it just comes back in a bigger way than ever. In fact, this will be the peak of the Klan, its all-time peak. So what is the Klan in the 1920s against? Well, they have a whole slate of things, groups that they don't like. They don't like foreigners. Obviously, they continue to dislike Black Americans. They hate Catholics, Jews. They're against pacifists. They're against communism and socialism. They're against the teaching of evolution. They're against bootlegging because they were in favor of prohibition. And they were also against birth control. So a lot of things that they were against. So what were they in favor of? They were in favor of what's known by an acronym of WASPs. This is White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So people who saw themselves as true blue Americans, they're the ones who are favored by the KKK. Here's an cover rather of a magazine here from the KKK called the Imperial Nighthawk, and you can see here from the image a very inflammatory headline. Poorly restricted immigration is one of the greatest perils confronting America. It's written by the Grand Dragon of the Realm of South. So the Klan's anti-Catholic stance, you can definitely see that in this political cartoon, where we have a smiling Klansman who, I guess, has murdered the Pope, or at least certainly he's sitting on top of him. Yeah, very disturbing image. So the Klan is something, again, we know started in the South during the Reconstruction era, and it was really kind of contained in the South. But in the 1920s, it's going to spread way beyond the South. You're going to see members all in pretty much every region of America. And at its peak, about 5 million Americans, 5 million, claimed membership in the Ku Klux Klan. Just to show you how politically powerful the Klan was, you can see this image of a Klan march through Washington, D.C. There's the U.S. Capitol in the background. And this shows us governors who are elected with Klan support, senators elected with Klan support, and major areas of violence. So again, it's a widespread thing. It's not just something in the Deep South any longer. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is immigration. And the last time we talked about immigration in a big way, we were looking at the difference between old and new immigrants. The old, of course, were primarily from Germany and Ireland, whereas the new immigrants were primarily from Eastern and Southern Europe, places like Poland and Italy, Greece and Russia, and so forth. Well, the nativists, of which you could definitely call the Klan nativists, were fearful of these new waves of immigrants. They feared that these people were coming in with ideas that were just too un-American. They're bringing in anarchism, they're bringing in socialism and communism, they're bringing in languages that are just too foreign for most English-speaking people apparently to listen to. It was just, they were very fearful of the shifting nature of America because of these new immigrants. And this prompts Congress to begin passing laws to restrict immigration. So this brings us to the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. And what this law said is that newcomers could not come to America in anything greater than 3% of the numbers that were already here in America in 1910. Now that probably doesn't make any sense the way I explained that, so let me explain it to you a different way. Let me give you an example. Let's say, and of course these numbers are not right, but they'll make more sense when I explain it this way. Let's say that in 1910 there were 100 people living here from Italy. Okay, well, according to this law, going forward, no more than 3 people from Italy can come in every year, right? That's 3% of the total number living here in 1910. But even this was still seen as too favorable to the new immigrants. So a couple of years later, in 1924, the Immigration Act of 1924 was passed, which cut the quota from 3% to 2%, and it also backed the year up from 1910 to 1890, which means you're looking at a smaller percentage of an overall smaller number. And the purpose really of this is to shut out, to the greatest extent possible, people coming from anywhere else other than Northern and Western Europe. We're trying to kind of freeze America's demographic and racial composition going forward. All right. Another sad aspect of this law was the outright banning of Japanese immigration totally. This would go hand in hand with the already existing ban on Chinese immigrants that was put into place during the Gilded Age. All right, now we're going to look at some cultural changes from the 1920s. And we're going to begin with a woman who's pretty famous, and she was controversial in her time. She's still controversial today. Her name is Margaret Sanger. And one of the reasons she was controversial from her era was that in a time period where things like sex were not talked openly about, she is coming out in favor of the use of birth control. She's talking about how women should have knowledge and access to birth control. And this was, of course, scandalous, to say the least. She's going to help set up an organization that's going to evolve into Planned Parenthood, which is still very much with us. Margaret Sanger is still controversial today. Partly, it's, of course, the issue of abortion and birth control and all that kind of stuff in the modern political sense. But she's also controversial because she had some pretty radical and, frankly, rather disturbing eugenic-type ideas. Here's a quote from Sanger. She said, "A stern and rigid policy of sterilization and segregation to that grade of population whose progeny is already tainted or whose inheritance is such that objectionable traits may be transmitted to offspring." In other words, she's talking about basically making sure that people who are seen as unfit or, in her words, tainted, don't have any kids. That's a very disturbing idea. All right, well, now let's look at the issue of flappers. And, most people, their knowledge of the 1920s is rather limited. They've heard the Roaring Twenties, and they know it has something to do with jazz and maybe some Prohibition or something like that. And they also probably have heard of the flappers. So the flappers were basically the young, energetic, outspoken, independent women of the 1920s. They cut their hair short. They wore short skirts. They wore a lot of makeup. They drank. They drove cars. They really were a pretty shocking display of women's independence in the 1920s. Now, not all women were flappers, of course, in the 1920s. In fact, most of them weren't. And in fact, even a lot of women probably looked at the flappers as being a little out of control. But that's the image that's kind of come through from the 1920s, because these women made a lot of headlines and certainly got a lot of attention for their activities, for their behaviors that were seen as so scandalous. All right, now let's look at a map, and we're trying to figure out what type of music is being shown as far as its spread in America. And I'm sure most of us already guessed that would be jazz. And you'll notice how jazz is spreading to the north and the west, and it's also going up here to New York. That brings us to the Harlem Renaissance. Now remember, in the 19-teens, 1920s, this is part of the Great Migration, where many African Americans are leaving the South or going to northern cities, sometimes in search of work or or just relief from the oppression of Jim Crow segregation. And as they settled in these cities, they would often kind of form basically a neighborhood, a community, where it's overwhelmingly African American. And one of these developed in Harlem, which is part of New York City. And there was a growing collection of creative people, artists, poets, musicians, writers, all of that stuff. And this really is kind of a celebration and rebirth of African American culture and racial pride in the United States. A good example of a member of this Harlem Renaissance would be Langston Hughes. You can see him at the bottom. People have called him the Poet Laureate of Harlem. Now, in the context of this Harlem Renaissance, we're also going to look at something that is known as Black nationalism. Remember, nationalism is pride and loyalty to a group you identify with. And this is a topic we're going to continue following, especially as we get into the 1960s. But in the 1920s, one person we can point to as a Black nationalist, as a Pan-African supporter, would be Marcus Garvey. So when I say Marcus Garvey was a Pan-Africanist, what that means is Pan means all, right? And so the Pan-African movement was this idea that all people of African ancestry should be kind of working together for a common cause to develop Africa, but also people who had left Africa, so whether they're living in America or the Caribbean or wherever, they should all be kind of together. In pursuit of that goal, Marcus Garvey is going to establish something called the UNIA, which stands for the United Negro Improvement Association. And the slogan for this organization was Africa for the Africans at home and abroad. Now keep in mind, this is the 1920s. Most of Africa, with the exception of just a tiny few pieces here and there, was still colonized by Europeans. So Africa was still carved up by the British and the French and Portuguese or Spanish or whoever happened to own the particular territory. Now, in terms of economics, the UNIA helped establish businesses that were owned by Black Americans. And this would allow Black Americans then to shop at Black-owned businesses to keep money in the Black community. And also, in a Black-owned business, they wouldn't have to worry about segregation. They wouldn't be second-class citizens in a white-owned store because it wouldn't be white-owned. A good example of one of these sort of subsidiaries of the UNIA was something called the Black Star Line Steamship Company. And the Black Star Line and the UNIA were part of a larger program that Marcus Garvey supported, which was this idea of kind of returning back to Africa, the idea of resettlement of African Americans in Africa. And this is something we saw all the way back to like the establishment of Liberia in the early 1800s, this idea of perhaps America being kind of a closed door, and that maybe African Americans might have a better chance in Africa. Never really took off, although I will say the UNIA did have millions of members at its peak, but it didn't see a mass migration of African Americans back to Africa. That never took place. So part of this Black nationalist movement was to kind of create a self-sufficiency within Black Americans, even going so far as to establishing so-called Black Cross nurses, right? Instead of Red Cross, Black Cross. All right, now let's move on and look at something else in terms of cultural changes. It's known as the Scopes Monkey Trial. Scopes Monkey Trial. So to understand the Scopes Monkey Trial, let's get a little bit of context. And at this time period, because America is changing so rapidly, ethnically, economically, in terms of gender roles, like America really is a country that's beginning to change, and a lot of people felt that those changes were putting America on the wrong course. And we can call these people fundamentalists because they believed that religion was beginning to lose its place in American society, and that they need to kind of go back to the fundamentals. And in particular, what they really feared was the teaching of the theory of natural selection from Charles Darwin. The fear was that if you subscribe to evolution, then you would be calling into question the biblical story of creationism, and that would destroy faith in God, the Bible. It would contribute to sort of a moral breakdown in America, particularly among the youth who would be learning this in school. So in consequence of this, several southern states began to pass laws that would ban the teaching of evolution. Rather than getting those ideas out there and letting people decide for themselves, it was decided just to go ahead and end those ideas before they ever reached the children in school. And in Tennessee, there was a governor named Austin Peay, who Austin Peay State University is named for him, and he passed this thing into law called the Butler Act, which again basically banned the teaching of the theory of evolution in Tennessee schools. Well, in 1925, a biology teacher from a little town called Dayton, Tennessee, was teaching evolution against the law, and he was indicted for breaking the Butler Act. Now, this is what we call a test case. In other words, a test case is when oftentimes someone might break the law purposely, they think is wrong, so that the court hears the case and then they can kind of expose what they think is wrong about the case, wrong about the law rather. And so Scopes is going to get some pretty powerful help in his campaign to defend himself against the Butler Act. Now, what happens is this becomes kind of front and center in American culture. It was kind of seen as a showdown between like the new way of doing things, with being more liberal and open and teaching evolution, and kind of the old way of doing things, which was much more conservative and biblically based. And so it was seen as kind of a culture war of sorts. And reporters from across the country descended on this sleepy little southern town, and it became the trial of the century. Although it turns out there's been several trials of the century, but that's a different topic for a different day. The defendant, John T. Scopes, gets help from, certainly from his time period, but maybe even all time, the most famous defense attorney. His name was Clarence Darrow. This is a guy who had made headlines for defending some pretty high-profile cases and being a very clever defense attorney. Now, the prosecution is going to get some assistance from a guy who's not from Tennessee, but he was brought in as seen as an expert on the Bible. His name is William Jennings Bryan. If that name sounds familiar to you, it should. This is the same William Jennings Bryan who ran in 1896, Mr. Cross of Gold, 16-1, all that stuff, and lost in 1896 and 1900. He was also part of the Anti-Imperialist League, and this is, frankly, his last hurrah. In fact, he actually perishes, I believe, shortly right after the trial, or maybe it was even during the trial. I've kind of forgotten, but it was right around this time. So you can see the culture war on display here, right? You can come buy your Anti-Evolution League books and magazines and pamphlets and everything else. Now, in the end, the court found John Scopes guilty, because of course he was guilty of breaking this law, and they fined him $100. And this precedent was set that the southern states were not going to back down. They were going to keep evolution banned. And in fact, Tennessee did not repeal this until 1967. All right, so that is it for our discussion of big cultural changes and some other demographic issues. In topic 7.8, we talked about the KKK. We looked at immigration restrictions. We looked over some cultural changes like Margaret Sanger, flappers. We looked at the Harlem Renaissance, black nationalism under Marcus Garvey, and then we finished up by looking at the Scopes monkey trial. All right, that is it for our discussion of the 1920s, and we'll be moving on in our next video.